Hi, my name is Gail Burns, and I want to welcome you to the Thayer House. You're in the keeping room of the Thayer House, and this is the area where most people did their chores and their work. We consider it crafts these days, but in 1785, this was all a chore for the people that lived here. Sylvanus had 9 people in his family, his mother and father, and 7 brothers and sisters, including himself. So there was a lot of mouths to feed. And in those days, everybody wore the clothing that they made. And they also had to grow everything that they ate. So there was a lot of work to be done and a lot of chores, and most of that took place in this keeping room. You're seeing a hearth here. This is the biggest hearth in the house. And there was always a fire going here. And it kept people warm because there was no heat, no electricity, no plumbing, no refrigeration in those days. It's kind of hard for us to imagine that in 2015, but that period of time, this is the way people lived. And it was a hard life. There was a lot of work to do, and this fire provided them with heat and also a place to cook. And there was always something cooking. And in the keeping room, you can see a lot of the implements and utensils that were used to do that. We have big black pots that were made out of, some of them were copper, but most of them were made out of a metal that the blacksmith would forge. And they were very, very thick and heavy, which were useful over the fire, and they were stood over a long period of time. There was usually a pot of porridge on the fire, and a lot of the leftovers, if there were any, were put into that pot, and they would add liquids and broth, and the next day they would eat that. And it was constantly going. Bread was always cooked. You can imagine 9 people in a family. Bread was a staple in those days. And they would bake the bread in a bake kettle. They would take coals from the fire and they would put them under this big black kettle, and then they would put the bread in here and they would put this top lid on, and they would put more coals on top of that, and that would bake the bread from the top and the bottom. And they could also use the back of this oven, which was used to heat the brick, and then they would put a loaf of bread in, or pies, and they would cook in quantity in that oven. And when it got really hot, they would take this, which is hot from the fire here, so I'm not going to lift it up, but that is a door that would go on the cover of that beehive oven. And they could cook, and they knew exactly the temperature and what time to take out the items because of experience. And that would provide them with a lot more area of baking. People had ways to preserve food because there was no refrigeration. So they would use either drying, and you see some of these items up here that we dried. These are actually apples. They might not look it because they're all shriveled up, but they would dry because by the fire the moisture would be taken out. And they could use those apples. They would gather them after they were dry, and then later on in the wintertime, when they needed them for cooking, they could make pies, or they could use them in their porridge. And they taste very much similar to what a regular apple would taste like. You'd be surprised. But drying was very important because it stopped food from spoiling. They also used herbs in their cooking. We have some herbs over here above the window, and everybody had herb gardens. And they would grow their herbs, and then they would bring them in and dry them, and they would use those as seasonings in their food. They made food taste a lot better, so they would put a lot of herbs to use. They also would salt their food. They would slaughter the animals in the wintertime that they raised in the barn, and they would salt to preserve, and they would use sea salt. They would actually go to the ocean and get their salt and dry out the water. It would evaporate, similar to what the apples were doing. And they would save that salt that was left after the evaporation, and they would use that to really coat their meats, and that would preserve them. Again, because there was no refrigeration. There were many ways that they also would cook. You see a lot of these utensils here. A lot of them were forged, as I said, out in the blacksmith shop. And children would help with a lot of the cooking and a lot of the chores. There was a wood fire constantly going, so all this wood that you see here would have to be gathered and chopped, and that was the job of the children. A lot of times they would do that even before they went to school. They would have to go out and gather the wood and bring it in, because, as I said, there was always a fire going here. There were also a lot of other things that they did to help out with the family. One of the things that they did was make butter in the buttery. They would actually gather wool from the sheep, shear the sheep, and they would spin on the spinning wheel. And then they would bring the wool into the loom room, and they would turn it into cloth for bedspreads or clothing or curtains. And they would also dip candles. That was, again, there was no electricity, so candles were used for lighting. Children did their homework through candles. And so I think what we'll do now is maybe show you a little bit of the other hands-on things that they did. We'll maybe go to the buttery and show you how they made butter. So if you'll come with me, we'll bring you in here.